I'd like to make a little tripod on which we can rest a question. The first is a personal anecdote. I'd been with Divine Mother for several years. One morning I got up, and as had been my practice for about 30 years, I started to do some yoga asanas. But just as I was doing a salute to the sun, I suddenly fell on my knees, sobbing. So I got myself up and I picked up the phone to Divine Mother, and she said, "Come, now." So, still with tears flowing out of my eyes, I got in the car and went to her house. And she was sitting there as calm as you like, and she said, "Good. I've been waiting for this." Because my words to her when I picked up the phone were, "The love has gone." So after she said, "Good, I've been waiting for this," she said, "It was the wrong kind of love." Now, after I'd been picked up off the floor and still crying, and she sent me off home, I started to ask myself, what does she mean? She always tells us that there's only one power. How can it be the wrong kind of love? And so I was bereft, and that was my question. And then the other day there was a little anecdote told in the first person about the priest who tended his flock for many, many years, but still felt unfulfilled within himself. And he heard of a great old sage, monk, abbot, who asked questions that evoked an answer in us. So I went to him and I said to him, "What is your question?" And he said to me, "What do they want?" And I said to him, "Well, I'm really here about myself." "Oh," said the old abbot, "then your question is, what do they really want?" So I was so perplexed by this question that I went to the chapel and I sat in silence. And as I sat, the hours went by, and then suddenly something whispered in my ear, "What are you leaving out?" And then the voice got louder and louder until it was coming out of the walls. "What are you leaving out?" It rang through me in every part of my body. And I got up and staggered down the passageway where the cells of the monks were situated. It was still night. And I knocked on the first door and said, "What am I leaving out?" And a voice inside said, "Me." I went to the next door and knocked on the door and asked the same question, "What am I leaving out?" And the voice said, "Me." And so it went on until I came to the door of the monastery, and I staggered out, and the sun was coming up, and I looked up and I said, "What am I leaving out?" And the sun said, "Me." And I dropped to my knees with my head on the ground, and the earth said, "Me too." And then finally, there's a story about an emir. Before he came to be an emir, he'd been trained. It was in his heritage. He knew the ways of state, diplomacy, and all of those trappings that would allow him to rule fairly and well. But when putting on the garb of an emir, he soon became fixated on himself and the appearances and those attributes that he perceived made him a powerful ruler. So he spent a great deal of time choosing garments for himself, seeking those who adulated him and gave him praise. And he became a cruel ruler, because anyone who crossed him was dealt with very harshly, tortured or off with their heads. Self-indulgence, self-adulation. He gathered around him only those who were going to give him that praise. He had several thousand slaves that did his every bidding. But then one day, he had a dream. Or was it a dream? Maybe it was a vision. He found himself in a great and shining place, and there in front of him was a light being, an angel perhaps, who had on their laps a great book and a pen in their hand. And this shining being looked at the emir and said, "You have erred. You must change. All of you must change. Your thoughts, your deeds." Well, when this image was gone, and perhaps the emir woke up if it was a dream, he immediately negated it and decided to give himself a diversion by going out hunting, which he loved to do, the chase. So with an entourage, he went out riding his most famous stallion, and there was a gazelle. And immediately the chase was on. But the gazelle was very agile and very swift, and before long it had gone off into the trees of the forest, and only the emir on his powerful stallion was able to follow, leaving behind his entourage. But as they entered the deep forest, suddenly the gazelle disappeared. And as the emir paused for a moment to orientate himself, gazing to see where that gazelle may have gone, a great wind came up. It blew and blew and blew. It stung his eyes. It tore his clothing. It whipped off his turban. His hair became matted and his eyes blinded. He fell off his horse, and his stallion was so afraid that it ran off, galloping. The emir was left lying in the forest, his clothes almost gone, his eyes burning. And so he fell into a coma, it seemed. And when he woke up, he was being tended by a group of nomads. And the nomads said, "Oh, one of our children found you in this state after the great sandstorm arrived." And immediately the Emir said, "I am the Emir, take me back to my palace." The nomads laughed at him. You, the Emir, look at you, ragged clothes, you've only one sandal on you, your hair matted. You're delusional. But they took care of him anyway. They tended him. They gave him a garment to wear, a rough goat skin. And they said, "You can come with us to the nearest city." And so the Emir followed the nomadic tribe. And when they came to the edge of this city, the Emir recognized it as his own kingdom. So he left the nomads and went to the gates of the palace and said to the guards, "I am the Emir, let me in." The soldiers laughed at him and said, You a beggar, the Emir." He said, "Yes, I was lost in the sandstorm, and I lost my clothes, and I've been taken care of by nomads, but I am the Emir." And the guard said, "Be off with you, otherwise I'll call the chief of the guards to put you in jail." But the Emir went on and on until the guard in exasperation said, Look through the gate. There is the Emir kneeling in noon prayer." The Emir looked through the bars of the gate, and there he saw a figure wearing his royal robes, even with his ruby ring on their finger. But this being was so shining, so illuminated, the Emir could hardly look at the visage. And the guard turned him away. Now the Emir wandered the streets, going from mosque to beg for food, until finally one day he recognized himself as the beggar. He was no longer an Emir, a king. He was a beggar, and he accepted himself, and he began to notice things, people. Those who gave him food looked on him with pity. He began to see people. But it so happened that the Emir, or the one who'd taken his place, every day came and gave food to those in need. So, of course, the Emir, now a beggar, took advantage of this largesse, and he would go every day, and he could hardly look at the face of this shining being who wore his robes and his ring, but he accepted the food that was given. But a strange thing happened. He began to get stronger. He was able to give service. He was able to carry the loads of those who were traders or women who were carrying heavy loads back to their family. And he grew stronger. And one day there was a fire because he usually slept in the outside stoves of the rich people, and one night he woke up to a fire, and he dashed in without a thought to himself and saved 2 children who were being burned. The next day, when he went to receive the largesse of the Emir, the shining being whispered to him, "You will soon have returned to you what you have lost." Now, a few days later, a wild horse came raging down the main street. Everyone tried to escape from this foaming-mouthed creature, but the Emir stepped out and stopped the horse in its tracks and was able to speak gently to it and calm it down. Afterwards, the people flocked around him to thank him for this brave deed. And a cobbler gave him a pair of sandals and said, "These sandals are worthy of the Emir himself." The beggar noticed these beings, and he thought to himself, "What fine people these people are." And he looked around into their faces, seeing each one of them. That day, when he went to receive the largesse of the Emir wearing his garments, instead of the shining being handing out the food and alms, there was just the royal robe and the ruby ring, and a voice inside the Emir said, "You are now ready. Claim your royal garment." The Emir put on his royal robe and his ruby ring and went to the gates of his palace, and he said, "I am the Emir. Will you allow me to enter?" And the guards bowed to him and opened the gates of his palace to allow him to enter. What relationship do these several anecdotes and this story, what is the thread? What is the commonality? What is it that you recognize that brings these three together? Remembering that every aspect of every story is a part of ourself. What is it you recognize?
The love of self.
Yes. Loss of self. But is it a humbling, like we know we've been through before, We'd been brought to our knees before in parts of our lives, forced to put our noses and our foreheads to the ground. What's the difference between those experiences and the experience that we recognize out of this tripod?
Acceptance.
Right?
Seems just accepting where we have erred, and just through our own experiences, just learning to accept and to differentiate, and just then go from there.
Right. What's the difference between being humbled and being shattered and annihilated?
Being humbled comes from the outside and shattered is from the inside.
Thank you, thank you.